There is a 25-second window every single morning that most adults over 60 are unknowingly using against their own heart, and it has nothing to do with the food they ate the night before, whether they exercise regularly, or which medications they take. It has to do with something that happens in the first half minute after the alarm goes off, a sequence so automatic and so deeply built into the routine of daily life that almost nobody ever stops to question it. And the reason most people have never heard this from their own doctor is not negligence. It is simply that a standard checkup is built around the obvious risk factors: cholesterol, blood sugar, weight, and a blood pressure reading taken at rest in a clinical office. Not what happens inside the cardiovascular system in the 25 seconds after the body shifts from sleep to being upright, but researchers who study the timing of cardiac events. Not just the causes, but the actual hour on the clock when they happen, have been pointing at this same window for years. Here is the figure that tends to stop people in their tracks. Several long-running studies have found that cardiac events cluster far more heavily in the first few hours after waking than at any other comparable stretch of the day, with some analyses putting the relative risk in that early window at roughly 3 times higher than average. A finding that has been revisited and largely reproduced across cardiovascular research for decades. And the reason that window carries so much extra risk has to do with a chain of physiological events that begins the moment the brain starts surfacing from sleep. A chain that most people unintentionally speed up rather than manage carefully in those first critical seconds. So stay with this, because the goal here is to walk through exactly what is happening inside the body during that short window, and then lay out a simple, 4-step morning sequence that takes under 2 minutes, costs nothing, and works with the body's natural biology instead of against it. And before going further, it is worth noting clearly that this is general health information intended to support a conversation with your own physician, not a replacement for one, and anyone with existing heart disease, a history of fainting, or any new or worsening symptoms should speak with a doctor directly rather than relying on a video for guidance. With that said, let's start with what the body is actually doing as a person wakes up, because this is the part that rarely gets explained clearly. Most people think of sleep as one simple, uniform state: eyes closed. The body rests, eyes open, but the underlying physiology is far more layered than that. And the transition out of sleep is where the foundation for a person's morning cardiovascular load is quietly being built. During deep sleep, the nervous system runs in what could be called a recovery mode. Heart rate is slow and steady, blood pressure sits at its lowest point of the day, sometimes 10 to 20 points below a typical daytime reading. Stress hormone levels are suppressed, and blood vessels are relaxed and open, giving the heart its best opportunity for genuine rest in the full 24-hour cycle. But here is what changes as the body prepares to wake. In the final stretch of sleep, the body's internal clock, driven by the circadian rhythm, begins a slow and quiet buildup. Cortisol starts a gradual pre-dawn rise, but the larger surge happens quickly, and it happens right around the moment of waking. Research in circadian biology has repeatedly shown that cortisol levels can rise substantially, in some studies averaging somewhere in the neighborhood of a 50% increase within the first 30 to 45 minutes after opening the eyes, a pattern researchers call the cortisol awakening response, one of the more pronounced hormonal shifts the body produces in any given day. Alongside that, the adrenal glands are also releasing adrenaline, and together these two hormones move through the bloodstream in the minutes right after waking. These hormones are not inherently a problem. They exist for a reason. They help prepare the cardiovascular system for the demands of being awake, raising heart rate, increasing blood pressure slightly, and narrowing blood vessels a bit to push more circulation toward the brain and muscles. In a younger person with flexible arteries and clean vessel walls, this system tends to work smoothly. But after 60, a few things have typically changed. First, arteries tend to be measurably stiffer. Since the elastic tissue in artery walls naturally degrades with age, and a stiffer artery cannot absorb a pressure surge the way a more flexible one can, So a hormonal wave that a younger cardiovascular system barely registers can produce a more noticeable spike later in life. Second, for a meaningful number of people who feel completely well and are managing their health responsibly, there may be some plaque buildup along artery walls. Not enough to cause symptoms in daily life or show up clearly on a routine exam, but potentially enough that a sudden pressure surge could disturb the surface of a vulnerable plaque deposit. And when that happens, it can trigger a clotting response. A clot in a coronary artery is a heart attack. A clot that travels to the brain is a stroke. And third, something that gets far less attention, blood itself tends to be different in the morning, after 6 to 8 hours without any fluid intake. Most people wake up in a mild state of dehydration, meaning the blood is thicker and more concentrated than it was before sleep, and clotting factors, the proteins involved in initiating clot formation, tend to be at some of their highest concentrations of the entire day right around this time. So by the time the alarm sounds, the body is already inside a window where the heart is working against stiffer vessels, under a hormonal surge, with blood that is somewhat more prone to clotting than usual. And then many people do the one thing that can make each part of that equation a little more demanding, sitting up and swinging their legs over the side of the bed in one quick motion. And it is worth being clear about why this small, ordinary movement matters. When lying flat, blood is distributed fairly evenly throughout the body and gravity is not a major factor. But the moment a person moves upright, especially quickly, gravity pulls a meaningful volume of blood downward into the legs and abdomen. The brain receives less blood for a moment, and blood pressure at the head can drop rapidly. In a younger, healthy cardiovascular system, a reflex called the baroreceptor reflex kicks in almost instantly. Sensors in the artery walls detect the pressure drop, signal the heart to beat a little faster, signal blood vessels to constrict slightly, and pressure is typically restored within a couple of seconds. But in many adults over 60, that reflex responds more slowly. The signaling takes a bit longer, and the vessels do not constrict as quickly, so blood pressure can drop noticeably within seconds of standing, which is often experienced as that gray, foggy, unsteady feeling right after getting out of bed. A sensation many people simply file away as a normal part of getting older, but it actually has a medical name, orthostatic hypotension. And it is a signal that the cardiovascular system is working hard to manage that rapid change in position. Clinical definitions generally describe it as a drop of about 20 millimeters of mercury or more in systolic blood pressure within a few minutes of standing, and research suggests it affects a substantial share of adults over 70, meaning a meaningful number of people watching or reading this may be experiencing it regularly without recognizing what it signals. And here is where it becomes particularly relevant to that early morning window specifically. When blood pressure drops suddenly after standing, the heart compensates by working harder. It essentially receives an urgent signal to increase output to restore circulation to the brain. And that compensatory effort, layered on top of the cortisol surge, on top of stiffer arteries, on top of thicker blood, is where a vulnerable heart is most likely to run into trouble. Studies tracking the timing of acute cardiac events consistently show a noticeable cluster in the mid-morning hours. Not because mornings are dangerous in some vague, general sense, but because of this specific convergence of biological factors that is often triggered or intensified by standing up too quickly. This pattern is subtle rather than dramatic. It does not feel alarming in the moment, which is part of why it tends to go unaddressed. Now, to make this more concrete, consider a composite example based on patterns seen repeatedly in clinical practice. An active man in his early 70s. Careful about his health, monitoring his blood sugar, checking his blood pressure regularly, taking a statin and a low-dose beta blocker as prescribed, with a recent echocardiogram and stress test that both came back reassuring. By any standard clinical measure, he was managing his cardiovascular risk well. Then one ordinary morning he silences his alarm and sits straight up right away. Within a few minutes he is in the kitchen making coffee. And shortly after that he is found leaning against the counter, confused and sweating, and ends up in the hospital within the hour. In a case like this, the event is often not a massive, life-ending heart attack but an acute coronary syndrome, a partial blockage caused by a ruptured plaque and a clot forming around it. And in reviewing the timeline afterward, the pattern tends to fit closely. The alarm, the fast sit-up, the immediate upright movement, stiff arteries, morning blood viscosity, and a compensatory spike disturbing a plaque that had been sitting quietly for years without ever announcing itself. What is striking in cases like this is that nothing in the person's clinical profile necessarily flagged the morning specifically as a vulnerable window. Nobody had suggested slowing down for the first minute of the day, and it is worth being precise here. None of the medication, monitoring, or testing in a case like this was wrong. All of it mattered and all of it was appropriate. What was often missing was a simple piece of understanding, that the transition from lying down to standing is its own distinct cardiovascular event, and that how those first 25 seconds are managed matters somewhat independently of everything else being done for heart health. Small, low-cost changes to that morning transition tend to make a measurable difference over time, with more stable morning blood pressure readings, and less of that lingering morning dizziness. Now, layering in one more factor that tends to get overlooked: breathing patterns during sleep. Many people breathe at least partly through the mouth during sleep, especially if they sleep on their backs, have mild nasal congestion, or have any degree of sleep-disordered breathing. And mouth breathing accelerates moisture loss noticeably compared with nose breathing. But even normal nose breathing over 6 to 8 hours results in meaningful fluid loss, with research estimating that the body loses somewhere around half a liter to a full liter of fluid overnight through breathing and normal perspiration, all with zero fluid intake to offset it. The result is that by the time the alarm sounds, a person is measurably dehydrated at a physiological level, well before the sensation of thirst typically arrives. And this matters for the heart specifically because blood plasma volume drops as a result. Think of the bloodstream as a hydraulic system. The heart works most efficiently moving fluid of a certain consistency through vessels of a certain diameter. And when plasma volume drops, the fluid becomes thicker, requiring the heart to generate more pressure with each beat to move it through the same space. Researchers have documented for decades that blood viscosity tends to run higher in the early morning hours, a pattern confirmed repeatedly in cardiovascular research since. And when this is combined with stiffened arterial walls, a cortisol surge, and a sudden drop in blood pressure upon standing, the heart is effectively being asked to manage several additional stressors at once within a very short window. Clotting research adds one more layer to this picture. Certain proteins involved in initiating and regulating clot formation follow their own circadian rhythm, and some studies point to these clotting-related proteins peaking in the bloodstream around the early morning hours, right around the start of that higher risk window. Platelet activity tends to follow a similar pattern. This does not appear to be a flaw in human biology so much as a leftover survival mechanism from an era when waking often meant facing physical demands or potential injury. But in the context of a vulnerable plaque and a morning hormonal surge, it becomes one more variable loading the equation, and the fix for this particular piece is refreshingly simple. A glass of water at room temperature, taken before standing up in the morning. Not coffee, since caffeine has a mild diuretic effect and can increase fluid loss. Not juice, which raises blood sugar before anything has been eaten. Just water, kept on the nightstand overnight so it is there before your feet ever touch the floor. Research on morning hydration in older adults generally points to measurable improvements in blood viscosity and platelet activity when fluids are replenished soon after waking. And while one glass will not fully replace what was lost overnight, it begins that process at the exact moment the cardiovascular system can use the support most. Now, bringing these three factors together, the hormonal surge, the postural blood pressure drop, and the change in blood viscosity into one practical sequence, a simple 4-point waking routine that takes roughly 90 seconds to 2 minutes total, with no equipment, no cost, and nothing to buy, designed to work with the body's biology rather than against it. Point 1 is a brief pause and slow breathing, roughly 15 seconds. The moment the alarm sounds, staying still rather than moving right away, remaining flat while the first wave of cortisol and adrenaline of the day begins. And using those first 15 seconds to gently activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the body's calming branch, before that hormonal wave peaks. This can be done with 4 slow, deliberate breaths, inhaling through the nose for a count of 4, holding briefly for a count of 1, and exhaling through the mouth for a count of 6. An exhale longer than the inhale is not incidental. This pattern is understood to stimulate the vagus nerve, one of the primary pathways through which the body applies the brakes to a stress response. And research on slow, extended exhale breathing has found measurable increases in vagal tone in both younger and older adults, with the effect often more pronounced in older participants. 4 slow breaths, about 15 seconds, gently engaging the calming branch of the nervous system right as that morning cortisol wave is cresting, before it has a chance to drive heart rate and blood pressure into a sharper spike. Point 2 is drinking water, roughly 20 seconds before sitting up, while still reclined, reaching for that glass of room temperature water left on the nightstand the night before and drinking it while still lying down. The timing matters here because once a person is upright, the cardiovascular cascade has already begun, so drinking water before that transition provides a small but meaningful volume buffer, gently thinning the blood, beginning to restore plasma volume, and slightly reducing clotting factor concentration before the heart is asked to work against gravity. Filling a glass of water and placing it on the nightstand the night before is a small action that can meaningfully shift the next morning's cardiovascular load. Point 3 is a graduated transition to standing, roughly 45 to 60 seconds. And this is where movement finally begins, but slowly and in stages, first rolling onto one side rather than sitting straight up. Since sitting up directly from flat engages the core abruptly and creates a sharper pressure change than rolling to the side first. From the side, using the arms to push up into a seated position with feet resting over the edge of the bed, without rushing to stand, and while seated, rotating the ankles slowly, roughly 10 circles in each direction, which is not simply a stretching exercise. The calf muscles act as one of the strongest venous pumps in the lower body, and rotating the ankles actively helps push pooled blood back upward toward the heart, beginning to rebuild the circulating volume the brain will need once standing. Research on ankle movement before standing has found that even about 1 minute of this kind of motion can meaningfully reduce the blood pressure drop that typically occurs upon rising in people prone to orthostatic hypotension. Sitting on the edge of the bed for a full 30 seconds allows the body's pressure-sensing reflexes time to calibrate before facing the full gravitational shift of standing, and then standing slowly, pushing up through the legs rather than pulling up with the back. And once upright, pausing for about 10 seconds before taking the first step. Point 4 is a brief, optional check-in, less about doing something and more about noticing how the body feels while seated on the edge of the bed. Any chest heaviness that was not there the night before, any unusual shortness of breath, any pain or pressure that seems to radiate, or any heart sensation that feels different from ordinary morning grogginess. Most mornings there will be nothing worth flagging, and that itself is a reassuring baseline. But building a habit of this brief, conscious check-in means that on the rare morning something genuinely feels different, that signal is far less likely to be rushed past on the way to making coffee. And if anything does feel notably different or concerning, that is a moment to seek medical attention rather than waiting it out. Altogether, this 4-point sequence takes somewhere between 90 seconds and 2 minutes each morning, costs nothing, and directly addresses the hormonal surge, the postural pressure drop, and the change in blood viscosity that together make the early morning one of the more demanding windows for the cardiovascular system. One additional group deserves a specific note here. Anyone taking a beta blocker for blood pressure or heart rhythm, and a considerable number of people over 60 do, should understand how that medication interacts with this particular morning transition. Beta blockers work in part by blunting the body's response to adrenaline, which is part of what makes them effective. But that same mechanism can also blunt the heart's ability to accelerate in response to a postural pressure drop upon standing, meaning the compensatory response that normally helps restore circulation when moving from lying to standing can be slowed by the medication. Research from long-running studies on aging populations has found that beta blocker use on its own is associated with meaningfully higher odds of experiencing orthostatic hypotension compared with those not on the medication. And this is not a reason to stop taking a prescribed beta blocker. These medications are prescribed for important reasons and can be genuinely life-saving. But it does mean that for anyone on this type of medication, the graduated transition described above is not merely a nice-to-have. It becomes especially important, since the heart's automatic compensatory response is already being moderated by the medication itself, giving the body a bit more time before standing fully upright. And anyone experiencing regular morning dizziness, while on a beta blocker, would do well to raise it specifically with their physician, since dosing and timing can sometimes be adjusted to help with exactly this kind of symptom. And that is a productive, specific conversation to have, one that starts with recognizing that the morning transition itself is worth examining. Bringing this all together, the early morning is not dangerous in some vague or random sense. It is dangerous for specific, compounding physiological reasons that stack on top of each other within a fairly narrow window. A hormonal surge that places extra demand on arterial walls, a postural pressure drop that forces the heart to compensate quickly, and blood that is thicker and somewhat more prone to clotting than at any other point in the day, and the habit most people perform without a second thought. Sitting straight up and standing immediately tends to intensify all three of those factors at once. The 4-point waking sequence described here does not require medication, a gym, or any change to diet, evening routine, or an existing medical plan. It simply asks for a glass of water placed on the nightstand the night before, 4 slow breaths upon waking, a gentle roll to one side, 30 seconds seated at the edge of the bed while rotating the ankles, and a slow, deliberate stand. A total investment of roughly 90 seconds, and it is worth reflecting honestly on how quickly you personally tend to move from lying flat to fully standing each morning, since that small window is one many people move through without ever giving it a second thought. And the people who could benefit most from understanding this are often not the ones actively searching for this kind of information, so sharing it with someone in your life who is over 60, or simply building this small routine into your own mornings, is a low-cost, evidence-informed way to give your heart a steadier start to the day, keeping in mind always that any new or unusual symptoms, ongoing dizziness, chest discomfort, or irregular heartbeat, deserve a direct conversation with your own physician rather than a video, since a personal medical history is something only a doctor who knows you can properly evaluate. And with that in mind, a heart that has worked continuously for decades without a single day off deserves a slightly gentler, more deliberate start to each new day.